we built React Navigation to solve a lot of these problems. It was config based. And then last year, I created this new navigation solution called Expo Router, which sits on top of React Navigation, but it adds file-based routing to your native application, which is really exciting. It's the first file-based router for native app development. The first version was really focused on like, how is this even possible? Is this reasonable? Can you pull off really complicated interactions with it?
Hello, welcome to the DevTools-fm podcast. This is a podcast about developer tools and the people who make them. I'm Andrew, and this is my co-host, Justin.
Hey, everyone. We're really excited today to have Evan Bacon with us. So, Evan, you're well known for building and working on Expo, and we're incredibly excited to talk about that. But before we dive into talking about Expo, would you like to tell our listeners a little bit more about yourself?
Yeah, of course. And thanks for having me on. I'm Evan Bacon. I'm the developer, the manager of DevTools at Expo. I also manage the web platform and our server integration. Before Expo, I was working at Frog Design, building apps and websites for various clients, and kind of a consultancy type role, which actually led me to finding Expo, just because we need to build and prototype really fast, and the needs just kept growing, and React and React Native just really hit a lot of those boxes for us. I switched over, and now I work on Expo for going on 7 years now, so for a while. And then before that, I was a Lego master builder when I was like 13 to 19.
Yeah, seems like a fun time in your life. I saw pictures of you with like Stan Lee and all different sorts of stars.
Yeah, it's really exciting. I just really like working on very big, intricate projects, and open source, fits that perfectly.
It's like just a continuation, like Lego, open source, like native web, mobile integration.
Right, yeah. Lego is the first signs that you might have a problem.
You heard it here, folks. If your kid's really into Legos,
yeah, keep them away from Rust. Actually, Objective-C was what got me hooked on programming. So there were some early signs.
So let's just dig in. So how would you explain what Expo is to people, and why might someone want to use Expo over, say, just raw React Native?
Yeah, it's actually a great question. So Expo is a framework for building React Native apps. And the target platforms are iOS, Android, and web. And in the same way that React DOM, you don't really write websites directly with React DOM. You generally have a framework or even some lower level tooling, which contains maybe like a bundler that can start in a CLI that can start a dev server, and maybe some tooling for exporting and hosting. React Native has similar problems, actually all those same problems, but then it's native development. So there's a bunch of other problems like upgrading and versioning and code signing and going through the app store. Very similar to web development, and Expo is a fantastic framework for doing that. There's a couple of other frameworks as well. So there's a community framework. Microsoft has one that they've been developing, and then there's Ignite by the Infinite Red folks. So it's very similar to the web, where you have like Next and Remix.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting now, like if we think about like where React is today. So yeah, sure, some folks still do just like write raw React, but like the meta frameworks are like a big part of how people write React apps today. And it is kind of interesting to watch that transition. So I worked on Artsy's React Native app. So they had a big React Native app, and the mobile team is actually who it went from being a native Objective-C app to being React Native, and they're the ones who sort of like advocated for that transition, just so the broader team could work on it. And seeing the pain, like without just going raw React Native is like, of course, and it's gotten a lot better in the last several years too, but in some ways, but it can still be painful. So one of the things of many problems is routing, just how you figure out which views to render, whether you're embedding them as a web view in a
Yeah.
native render or whatever. So could you tell us a little bit more about like how Expo helps with that?
With routing?
Yeah.
Yeah, so navigation on native is a really tricky problem, and we've been working on it for a while. Uh, our, our base effort was this suite of libraries called React Navigation, which is the main way that people build navigation with React Native. And some of the problems that you face with native navigation that you don't really face on web is that you need, the web, you have like back buttons, you have URLs that you can move around with. And actually, web is kind of moving more in this direction of how native routing works, where you have like nested routes, for example. Like that's a huge one. Previously, you just kind of, if you had like maybe a Next.js website, you would build like route by route, and then you had maybe like one shared layout element. But in native app, you have tons of shared elements between things. So nesting is actually a pretty big part of native navigation that's come to web. So I think it's some cool convergence there. But then you also have like parallel routes is another big one. On native apps, you don't have like the ability to create multiple contexts, like effectively multiple tabs. So tab bars will often fill in a lot of that purpose. If you think about like Twitter, maybe you're on like the home tab, and then you're doing something, but you want to reply with a tweet. So you'll tap over to the search tab, you'll find something, and then you'll tap back over to the home tab. On web, especially like mobile Twitter, actually, if you tap back on that home tab, it will like reset you to the main homepage. Whereas on native, it will preserve that stack memory inside, and it will take you to that tweet page. And if you tap the tab again, then it will pop you back up in home. So there's a lot of complexity that I think the web has historically been able to kind of get away without having to add. And on native, you just need a lot of that. So we built React Navigation to solve a lot of these problems, and it was config based. And then last year, I created this new navigation solution called Expo Router, which sits on top of React Navigation, but it adds file-based routing to your native application, which is really exciting. It's the first file-based router for native app development. And the first version was really focused on like, how is this even possible? Is this reasonable? Can you pull off really complicated interactions with it? And so far, yeah, people have had a lot of really good success with it. So it is a nested router. You can do parallel routes with it, and then you navigate everything using URLs, which is pretty sweet, because one of the most complicated and important features of a native app is for a lot of native apps, not a silver bullet, but for content-driven native apps specifically, is universal linking, where you have deep links that can go into the app, but then you connect those deep links with your website. So you can send this is like how I think like Twitter and YouTube and basically every major website works, where if I send you a link to, for instance, like a TikTok, if you have the TikTok app installed, it will open the TikTok app, and then it will take you to that content in the app. This is very hard to set up, and it's very hard to test, especially like testing is such a pain with this feature, because it's not a server. So you don't have like a request and a response. You just have a request. And then you would need to have like some E2E test structure set up to see if the page actually worked. So with Expo Router, because everything is URL driven, you have universal links automatically. Everything always works for everything on every route. And because you use like route parameters to pass data around, the state between routes can also be serialized and shared and like publicly accessible, which is great for testing. It's great for sharing. And in the same way that like apps have historically, the apps that have been able to pull off universal links, they pair that with a server rendered or a static rendered website. And then what this gives them is effectively SEO for their native app. Because if you have SEO for your web representation of a tweet, you click on that and it takes you to the native version. You have SEO, so your app, it can be searched and it can be indexed and it can be found. Whereas indie devs don't have access to that because it's just too difficult to pull off. So with Expo Router, you get all that automatically, because you get a website, which can be static rendered, and then you have a native app, which is universally linked to that website. So some pretty exciting capabilities are added by adding file-based routing. And we just released V3 maybe 3 hours ago as of recording this. And so that
Congrats.
adds, yeah, thank you. It was a tricky one. This adds API routes. So you have servers that you can now deploy based on your file-based routing system. Improved typed routing. So you have like autocomplete when you make links. And then now it has route-based bundle splitting, which is something that we just never had before. This is currently disabled on native because we want to add one more feature in v4, which will make it like pretty slick to support basically indicating if a route should have the bundle be offline or if it should be online, or like how it should revalidate the caching policy for that split bundle, because native apps obviously offline support is very fundamental. So the possibilities are really endless, and yeah, so the routing and navigation is one problem, but by adding the file-based router, we were able to unlock and solve a slew of other problems.
Yeah, it seems like looking at the examples, like it's a very natural fit with the like nested layouts and stuff. Like it reminds you of Remix, or reminds you of App Router. Then all the new stuff that you've brought to Expo Router makes it like look so simple. Like I know Next.js pretty well. I could just switch over to Expo Router now and probably be pretty productive pretty quickly.
Yeah, which is really exciting. And this also ties in heavily with how our web support works. So historically, the way we added web support was it was a web version of how native support worked. And native support has always been just kind of like an SPA, right? A client rendered single page application. You have one root component that renders everything. Everything's downloaded, everything's offline. When you start up the app, then all of the code executes to render the application. So the web equivalent of that would effectively be like create React app, right? It would be everything's offline, everything renders all at once, it's all downloaded at once. And that is not a reasonable website for, for many different eras of web development. And so by introducing this file-based routing system, we're able to really increase the complexity of what's possible on web by simply, improving what you can do on native. So historically, with native, like you've had SPA, and then all your data fetching is all client-side data fetching. But now we're able to do substantially more complicated things, which we have planned for v4. Basically, the scope of when I came up with Expo Router was it's very large. So we split it into 4 releases, and we just put out v3. We're ready to do the final one, which kind of ties it all together. And it's going to be, I started working on it a couple of days ago, and it's already pretty mind-blowing, just like what we'll be able to do on native.
This week, we'd like to welcome our new sponsor. Without our sponsors, this podcast isn't possible. Our new sponsor is Codecrafters. Codecrafters is a platform that makes programming challenges for experienced software engineers. If you're looking for a weekend project that takes you to the edge of your programming abilities, you have to check them out. They have a bunch of really cool challenges. I saw on the website you can build your own BitTorrent, build your own Git, build your own Docker. All these challenges make you walk through these like popular tools, and you get to learn how they're built and how the protocols work, while at the same time maybe even learning a new programming language. They support a host of popular programming languages such as Rust, Go, and JavaScript, and a whole bunch more. When they signed up to be a sponsor, I made an account and went through their Build Your Own Redis challenge. As the listeners of this podcast know, I'm a front-end dev, so I didn't really know what Redis was going into this, but after building it, it surprised me that Redis is actually a pretty simple thing. It's just a key value store, and then along the way, you have to learn some of the foundational technologies too. So when I started, I actually had to read up about TCP. They don't just point you towards a Wikipedia article or some other YouTube videos. They also have really nice learning content that like steps you through what TCP is, why it was made. And as a web developer, I should probably know that. It was really fun to get to learn about that, and I'm probably going to continue with the challenge. Besides the content, even the user experience is targeted towards experienced software developers. For example, instead of trying you to a custom in-browser editor, Codecrafters lets you build everything locally. You can use your own IDE, your own terminal. All you have to do is push, and they run tests for you. To try out Codecrafters for yourself, visit codecrafters.io/devtools-fm. At that URL, you'll get a discount, but you'll also be supporting the podcast. Do you not want to hear these ads anymore? Well, become a member on one of the platforms where we support it. You can head over to Patreon, YouTube, Spotify, or Apple Podcasts to become a member. And if you want to find another way to support the podcast, you can always head over to our merch store at shop.devtools.fm. There you can grab a cool corduroy hat like the one I'm wearing right now. If you want to apply to be a sponsor of DevTools.fm, head over to devtools.fm/sponsor to apply. And with that, let's get back to the episode. Yeah, I was looking at Expo, I think like 4 or 5 years ago before you guys shipped web support. And like for me back then, it was kind of like a non-starter. I was like, well, I want a web app and now I have to build this whole second thing. So it seems like you guys have come a really far way. Is it from like the rendering perspective? Do I have like just one index or do I have like multiple app indexes, like one for my website and one for my apps?
Yeah, so that's actually a fantastic question. There's a lot of these kind of cross-platform maximalists who you can get a good sense for like what is the current state of code sharing from following some of these people, and some of them are really successful, like fantastic products. Fernando Rojo comes to mind. He was just in Forbes 30 under 30 for his like this product Beat gig that he built, which is like an app and a website. It's like an Expo app and it uses Next.js to bundle the Expo components on web. And right now, the limit is people will set up monorepos, and the monorepo will have kind of like an app directory, a shared components directory, which is mostly universal components. So think like React Native Web and Expo components. And then they'll have a maybe like a Remix or a Next.js website. And then that will have all the routes and re-export the components. And that is pretty good. It's better than it was a couple of years ago, but it is fundamentally, that's a pretty big fork. Like if you think about what goes into setting up your data fetching and how much time you spend on trying to reduce like waterfalls and getting the content to load correctly and authorization, authentication, just the whole flow of orchestrating how your content is presented to users, forking at that level is ridiculous. So with Expo Router, what we would like to achieve, what I'm pretty confident we will achieve by later this year, is a system where your data fetching and your rendering patterns can be shared across web and native, and then your components can also be shared. And I think at that point, the layer of forking, like where things will split between web and native, will move up to mostly your layout routes. Like I think layout routes will be a big one, because on native, your tab bar, it's this very distinct look. And then on web, you usually have like some sort of very responsive header. Maybe it pulls out into like the side drawer. And then I think people will basically switch at the layout route level, but then the content of the page, like a Twitter feed, that it basically already looks the same across web and native. And then there'll probably be other places, maybe like aspects of your data fetching will be forked a little bit in behavior. But already it isn't that forked. If you think about like your server is universal. I think it would actually be neat if you could, in some cases, fork your server logic for things like maybe server rendering. Like if you were to server render a list, maybe you would have components inside of that list change based on the platform that made the request to the endpoint. Like I think this is kind of a crude example, but like ChatGPT, when you use ChatGPT on mobile, it has a different prompt than what the web mobile is. It's like you are on mobile, so your response should be like fast and snappy and like easy and it like doesn't copy and paste, things like that. So maybe you could scale that concept up to how the components are rendered. Like they're smaller, they're faster, or it's like a native device. So maybe the video is higher definition or something like that.
Yeah, it was one of the things that like was pretty eye-opening very early on for me when using React Native is the sort of like write once, run anywhere thing is not real, not in a real, like not in a broad sense. It's like, sure, React Native Web exists and has gotten significantly better than it was, and you can write a component and share it across platforms. But I think the value here often is like that you're working in a familiar technology across platforms, and that alone gives a lot of value versus, trying to share everything. I'm sure the story is much improved, but at Artsy, we went through some real pain trying to share a lot of components. We ultimately only had a design system that was shared across web and mobile, and then eventually they actually split down the design system. So even that got split up. And then they were just doing like tokens, like design tokens they were using. But yeah, that's a hard problem. It's a hard problem to like share as much as you can between those platforms.
Yeah, it's a great observation. I think one way to frame it would be it's about the flexibility, the freedom to share various different things, because your criteria depends, it changes, based on what you're trying to build. So in some cases, universal components, whatever, like if it was a very content driven, kind of almost like markdown type app, text should look the same across platforms. But if it's something that's really refined in various ways to like the device, the physical capabilities of the device, then then components become less of a priority to share. And with React Native, what was cool was that you could share React, right? Like the state manager and the component part. And what fell into the JSX was not shared. And I think then React Native Web came along to like the Twitter website is still built in React Native Web. And it actually came along not to solve sharing code so much as like solving issues with web development at scale that a lot of things solve in different ways now. Like Tailwind, for instance, solves a lot of the same styling issues, like in composition. When you build a website, especially a couple of years ago, there was a lot of globals and a lot of like leaking things around. And now that's started to get much tighter, and things have become more component based, more encapsulated, without compromising too much on the ergonomics of web development. Tailwind is, I think, a great example of that. Which is important to note. React Native Web is probably not the long-term direction of how you should write components that are like universal. Like why isn't there like div that works on iOS and Android? Why do you need Vue that works on web? So I think with React Native, you should have that flexibility, but I don't think that building a website with React Native means you have to use these components which feel very primitive to the platform. I think you should be able to change. In fact, changing out JSX is probably one of the easiest things to change out in Universal React. Some of the harder things to change out are like the bundler and the build pipeline, the navigation, the rendering patterns. Things like that are, I think, where Universal React has historically broken down. And these are the problems that we focus on with Expo Router.
Since you just mentioned bundling, we might as well jump into that next. On web, you have lots of different options for bundling, and it seems like you used some of those options in the past in Expo, but a little recently, you guys decided to focus just on the Metro bundler. So for the people who don't know, what is the Metro bundler, and then why did you choose it going forward with the project?
Yeah, it's a really interesting story. So, or not, depending on how you feel about bundlers. Metro is the bundler that Meta develops. So it's open source. It's written with Flow. And it solves a lot of problems that Meta has had internally. So, for instance, they use Metro to develop the Facebook app, which uses React Native. And so there are problems that they face with scale and working across teams and integrating with a monorepo. And so their bundler is, or at least was, very, very foreign in its techniques to like how everything else worked. And so with React Native, it has always used Metro, and switching bundlers, which I've tried many times in the past, is very tricky. And fundamentally, one of the reasons why it's actually so tricky is because Metro has all these techniques like lazy bundling and incremental. Everything is very incremental. Like any file at any point can be an entry point to bundling. So you can pass in any file, and then it will traverse the tree all the way down and return whatever it needs. It has very aggressive caching, which makes plugins pretty difficult to write, but it makes it very fast. And then it also means that you can have shared caching. So you can take those cached artifacts, you can bundle them on any machine in any context, and download them on a different machine, use them. So this is like what Airbnb and Meta use. So they have a cron job which runs against the code and then is constantly bundling it, and then they just check out the cached artifacts like live as they're developing on it. So it has some very interesting techniques. Actually, they're the only bundler which I think is kind of similar, or I think the bundler that shares the most similarities to it is the new Turbo Pack bundler, where from Vercel. It has a lot of technology that looks very, very, very familiar to Meta's. I guess Meta internally they have this bundler called Haste, and Metro takes a lot of inspiration from that. I think TurboRev also takes some nods from there as well. But probably the most important part of Metro for us is when I was coming up with Expo Router and what I wanted to build. One thing that was really important there was the ability to bundle server code and client code kind of simultaneously, or the ability to orchestrate them very neatly together. So Metro, it actually, I think it kind of inadvertently built a very, very important web bundling feature, which is a multi-dimensional graph. So this is when you have a graph which can share a lot of resources between different criteria, different abstract criteria for bundling. So Metro did this for bundling iOS and Android kind of at the same time simultaneously. But this can actually be used really well for server and client simultaneously. And when you consider, like how server components are bundled, which requires multiple passes, looking at the server and the client, creating the manifest, being able to combine a multi-dimensional graph for starting with server and then spiking off and doing the client and then sharing resources while you're doing that and doing that in like many different ways. Metro actually would be really good for that. So kind of trying to skate to where the puck was going, we just decided we would buckle down. And we also knew we'd have to build a ton of bundling features in order to make Expo Router work. Like Expo Router is primarily a bundler-driven project. So we knew we had to build a bunch of things, and we kind of traded, okay, we'll build bundle splitting, but we'll get the multi-dimensional graph part kind of for free. It's been great. Like when we do incremental bundling, we have incremental bundling as part of Expo Router. It's an experimental feature right now. And we worked with the Meta team on this actually because it was something that they developed for the Facebook app. And when you navigate to different routes, at that point, when you navigate to the route, then it will fetch the route in a suspense boundary and download it. And at that point, will it start bundling it? See, traditional web bundlers, often what they would do is they would bundle the entire thing together and split it up and then send you the pieces, which is what you always need to do in production. It's the most efficient way because you know what all the pieces are, so you can bundle split and you can tree shake. But in development, it's much faster to just be more incremental and lazy about these things, make less assumptions about the final shape.
Especially when you have an app as big as Facebook's.
Right, yeah. And actually, I think Module Federation in many ways tries to solve many of these same problems, like Webpack's Module Federation, where you can work across different teams and you're only bundling the part of the app that you want to work on. So you'll like define what that section of the app is. And with Metro, you can define that by just having async import boundaries. And then the bundler will stop crawling when it gets to those boundaries. So you can, if the structure of your app is such that you have like a team that works on search and a team that works on the feed and a team that works on profiles, then you've kind of naturally created some module federation shape here. If you combine that with like the very complicated caching, where you basically are automatically not bundling the search page by never visiting it.
Yeah, it seems like we're in web, we're trying to build all of those things again. Like what you were saying about like the combined module graph, like literally, I think Tobias came on here and said that same thing when we were talking about TurboPack. So interesting to see the same thing being developed in two different areas of the world. One thing that stands out to me about Expo that I've been going through the docs is you guys seem to have tried to adapt a lot of like web things into the native world. And one that stood out to me is CSS. Like there is no CSS on the native platform. Mm-hmm. How did you guys make that work, and like what can you do with it?
Yeah, so the CSS support in Expo, like the official support, is web only. Yeah, and there is a way to use it on native. It's kind of it's a community project in a way. It is developed by like someone on my team, so it's community, but it's just like not kind of part of the blessed workflow. And the logic there is, if you want to make the universal linking work, which I think is really important that we nail, for a variety of reasons. But if you want to make that work, then it needs to be like pretty compelling that people can build websites with Expo Router as well. And if you're missing like CSS because native doesn't have it, then that's kind of a no-op. So there are certain areas where we do kind of temporarily fork away, or rather, maybe it's not a fork so much an escape hatch. So there are places where you can escape hatch and add CSS if you so choose. And I think it's important that we have all that. Like right now, we don't have a way to do static generation for native apps, but you can do static, like build time static generation for your website. We do plan to, over time, actually add build time static generation for native apps. I think we'll have that in a pretty usable state by Q3. But CSS is similar. So we do have CSS, and there's a project. It's a pretty sweet project called Native Wind. And what it does, it lets you use Tailwind on native. And this is pretty great because when you use it on web, it just turns off, like it does nothing. It just like Tailwind is just running. So right out of the box that it's going to be a very efficient like web styling library. And you don't have to worry about like, is this going to hamper my web performance in a place where performance matters a lot? The way Native Wind works internally is it has a CSS parser, and it like literally parses CSS into native styles. But there are a lot of places where CSS doesn't work on native, or at least in the context of React Native. So it's like, a lot of things like cascading, for example, don't work in declarative styles. So if you pair that CSS to native parsing with Tailwind, which actually enforces a lot of the same rules as React Native has, then you end up with a system that kind of is CSS on native. So kind of works and doesn't work. Like we could maybe add native CSS, but we would need like some different extension, like something that indicates that it doesn't actually cascade, which is a very important part of the CSS extension. And then Native Wind's also kind of cool because one issue we have with static rendering is like in React Native, there's really no declarative responsive styles. Like you have Flex1, which indicates that it should be flexible, but you don't have media queries. So the way you would do these is you would add a hook that's like use window dimensions, and then you would check the window dimensions and change the styles based on some dynamic hook. But you obviously can't use that with static rendering because you'll get a hydration error. You need some way to declare what the styling looks like at various different breakpoints. So Native Wind gives you a way to basically do that declaration on web, and then behind the scenes kind of polyfill it in this crazy. It's actually very cool. The Native Wind source code, it's a crazy way where it will, based on where you add the class names, kind of intercept the style and inject the hooks so that the hooks do exist, and you still have like the rules of React, but they only exist whenever you use them. It's the same with animations, and it's the same with appearance, like light mode, dark mode. So it is pretty snappy, pretty snazzy, and I think it's a good primitive. Like people will probably build a lot of things on it. Like we see people build like shad CN type libraries, and they build it on top of the Native Wind primitive. I'd say you built like a really good open source library is if it supports other projects as well. If people can like build on top of it. It's really one of the things that's defined a lot of React success is that you just get going and build React Native on top of it, and so on and so forth.
There's your Legos.
Yeah, exactly. It's a good Lego.
Yeah. No, it is.
Yeah, it's interesting to hear that because on the last episode we recorded, we had Christopher Shadow on, and he was like, "Oh yeah, we meant to do CSS, but nobody ever asked for it, so we never did it." And here we are.
Yeah, people definitely ask for more styles in React Native and Yoga. We're working on adding more native styles to Yoga. It's tricky because Yoga is very, very popular, even outside the scope of React Native from Component Kit. And if you look at like any of the top Google apps in the App Store, like you go to the licenses, Yoga will be in there. Like it's everywhere. So adding and changing the default styling is pretty tricky.
Yeah.
the ultimate form of changing the tires on the moving bus, so to speak.
Yeah, for sure. Yoga is such a cool project. There's a React render to the terminal, like a TUI app that I was using for a little while back, and it uses yoga. And I was just like, it's pretty cool.
Yeah, there's a project by Vincent Reamer, which is pretty sweet. It's called React Native DOM, which is kind of like React Native Web, but it runs yoga in a web worker. So it's actually very similar to what Satori does, where Satori also runs yoga in a web worker in order to do the layouts. And what Vincent was able to do with this was create these like wild animations where you would like resize things, because it was doing all of the layout calculations separately, and you could like animate things based on those animation layouts. So yeah, yoga is a cool project.
Somewhat while we're on the topic of these tools that bridge web and native, something we were talking about before we started the call was sort of this state of native tooling used in the web. I'm curious, like what sorts of things that Expo is built on, and then just to talk more about tooling in general. Like, so there's a big push to rewrite a lot of things in Rust. We've had the Biome folks on before. We've had other folks who are rewriting things in Rust. We had Charlie Marsh, who's working on a Rust tooling for Python. I'm curious about, both like what Expo is sort of like doing internally and your posture on this, and like what you think about it in general.
Yeah. So we were talking a little bit before this about Rust. And I mentioned that Expo with our flavor of Metro uses Lightning CSS for the CSS parsing, which is super fast, lightning fast even. Devin is extremely talented engineer. Highly recommend people check that library out. You're probably already using it. I think everyone's moved over to Lightning now in some capacity. And we use Babel still for a number of transpilations. We lean really heavily on our caching in the bundler and then we also have we actually Metro is very similar to Jest. Like a lot of the components that make up Metro are very similar to the components that make up Jest. And so the Jest worker is used in Metro to create the multi-threading mechanism. And yeah, we're able to offset a lot of the AST improvements. I've tried adding SWC support to React Native, and it didn't move the needle too much. Like it's a bit faster. It wasn't substantially faster. And then when you introduce Babel, because generally what you want to do is have some AST parsing for modules which don't change, like your node modules, and then use Babel for your application code, so that users have like an expressive and easier API for transforming their own code. And once you introduce that, then the savings kind of net back out to not be super positive. Then on the other side of the coin, there's Bun. Bun's amazing. I love Bun. Jared Sumner is a legend. And if you use Bun, it makes all your JavaScript faster. I guess another native tool that comes to mind is Static Hermes, which was released, or it was announced kind of earlier last year. And for people who aren't familiar, Static Hermes is the engine that we use in React Native. It supports bytecode, so you can do all of your evaluation ahead of time, which actually creates a really interesting problem for React Native, where you can have like a 20 megabyte JavaScript bundle, and it just starts up in like under a second because all the evaluation is done at build time. And Static Hermes pushes that even further, where it combines a typed language with the compilation. And by using the types inside of, so I think the main thing that they build against is Flow, but presumably you'd also be able to use TypeScript. You could actually generate machine code from that JavaScript. And so this is something we'll be using with React Native in the future, where part of your app could be compiled to machine code from JavaScript, and then you could just write native code directly with JavaScript. The performance would be amazing. So I don't know. I wish maybe more people in the JavaScript community went that direction of like using the types in TypeScript, because TypeScript's a pretty easy sell for a lot of people, and then getting some native performance out of that.
Yeah. I have seen like compile to WASM versions of TypeScript. and some interesting things. Just like you can kind of do a limited subset and get some really powerful stuff out of it. But then again, Meta's engineering team is pretty wild. They're able to pull a lot of this stuff off. I wonder if any of the stuff from Static Hermes came out of. I don't remember. Do y'all remember this project that Meta was working on a few years ago that like did ahead of time execution of JavaScript to like simplify stuff? Like it was called I forget. Andrew, do you know what I'm talking about? Is a project for Meta that like ran JavaScript ahead of time to like optimize
Pre-construct, pre-something, pre-pack.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I wonder if any of the research from Prepack went into Static Hermes or if they're taking a very different approach there.
Yeah. Yeah, it's an interesting question. You definitely see a lot of like meta ideas, which are just kind of fundamentally different from other ideas, kind of sometimes trickle out into the space. Like with Metro, all of the node modules are transpiled like application code. And then they just rely on caching to solve that. And I think one of the main drivers of that is that they don't really use node modules as much. They use like the haste module resolution. And so all the code is basically treated as application code anyways. And yeah, like you see varying degrees of that influence in other tooling.
Yeah. I think regardless of what it is, it can take a lot of work on any platform to make performant code, and you can definitely make non-performant code regardless of what languages you write it in.
For our config reading, we use Shoecraze. Have you guys heard of Shoecraze? Yeah, it's fantastic. It's just like a fork of Babel. So it's written in like TypeScript or something, and it's super performant for like if you're trying to transpile a couple files. It's like one of the fastest options you can find, like faster than basically anything else in the market.
Interesting.
Yeah, JavaScript.
Always bet on JavaScript. But speaking of things that aren't quite JavaScript, I saw something called continuous native generation. You got a few blog posts about it, and it's called out in the docs. So what is that, and why would I use it?
Yeah, it's another great question. Continuous native generation is it's a process and like a workflow. It's an idea. It stands for, or the abbreviated is CNG, and there can be different implementations of CNG. So our implementation of CNG is Expo pre-build. And this is, you can think of it like a bundler for native code and native projects. So based on the code inside of your, some configuration that when run with a command will generate the iOS and the Android or whatever platform folders, which will have a native runtime inside of it. And this is actually one of our most popular projects. And it's kind of foundational to how Expo works now. So for instance, if you have a camera library installed, like Expo Camera, React Native Camera, then when you run the continuous native generation command, it will know, okay, like this library indicates that it needs this camera permission added, and maybe it needs this like extra dependency added, and these file changes. And then it will like take all those instructions from all the packages and use those to generate the project, which solves a lot of really fundamental issues with React Native. Like the biggest issue historically has always been upgrading, and probably what like most people have done since the beginning of React Native is just at some point give up, create a new project, and copy their code into that new project, and then run it again. And it's actually like surprisingly worked out very well for a lot of people. And CNG is kind of like a democratized and organized version of that process that you're just always running. And we find that this also works really nicely, especially over time with your project getting larger and larger, because when you want to uninstall a project, and it has all these extra dependencies, you create these orphaned processes, these orphaned references, where maybe you add that camera permission, but maybe you add some other camera library which also has a camera permission, and they're like there'll be overlap, and then you just won't remember to remove everything. With CNG, all that goes away because you nuke everything, and the only thing that can ever be added is the code that currently exists in your project. And so what this allows you to do is just focus on building a JavaScript app most of the time, and then you spend other time thinking about writing config plugins, which will generally take like some serialized representation of a native file and then interact with other plugins. And what's great about that is that the config plugins can be unit tested. So if you think about like a React Native library that has like 50 setup steps, or any native library has 50 setup steps. It's like with a config plugin, you can be continuously testing and just testing those setup steps and ensure that they always work. And that was like the basic premise. Now it's actually been pushed even further. So people use CNG to build really outside the scope of what React Native is normally used for. Someone sent me a DM this morning, which was they've been using a bunch of config plugins that I just make in my spare time. And one adds like Apple settings, like settings to your app in the Apple settings app, home screen widgets, and they have like quick actions. And outside of widgets, the other two are pretty useless features, but Apple does reward you if you use a lot of their features. Like they will, like they scan these things statically, and then they generally, no one really knows what goes on inside of Apple, but there are posts which say like if you want to be recommended for like the editorial posts that show up in the front, then using more of their features will get you shown there. So the problem with these features is that when they aren't super useful, adding them increases the complexity of your project, which slows down the build and then makes it harder to work on features that actually do matter, or it makes it harder to upgrade your app. So with config plugins, it's really easy to add, remove, and then when you add features like this, it doesn't increase the complexity of your project because it's just like it's represented as JSON. So yeah, it's a really fantastic piece of technology, and we're really excited about how well it's worked. When we wrote it, we were not sure if it would. We had no idea that it would work this well. So it's awesome. And in many ways, it's what's allowed things like Expo Router to exist, because by eliminating how much time you have to spend thinking about like the code signing and the native build and all of this like upgrading problems, then you just think about actually building your app with JavaScript. At which point you start thinking about it almost like a website. You're like, how can I really do the most with what's in this JavaScript? And so we made config plugins, rolled it out maybe like 2 years ago. And then a little bit later, we were like, all right, it's time to do Expo Router. Like we can focus on really making universal app development an incredible experience.
That's huge, though. That's huge.
Yeah, it's a really important piece of this puzzle. So I highly recommend people use it if they're using React Native and haven't moved over to it yet.
Is that essentially what makes it possible for like me as a person developing on Expo to never open Xcode?
That's part of it, yeah. So the other part is EAS Build, which is our cloud build service. The EAS Build has two pieces. One is the cloud build service, and one is the authenticate, like the code signing part. And the code signing part also kind of integrates with our CNG implementation a little bit. So it can like look at if you have a widget and if you have an app and if you're using, like paid services like merchant IDs, and then it will synchronize all of those with Apple. Because if those aren't synchronized by the time you make your build, then it will fail. And so yeah, we added the authentication, which is pretty sweet, because then as your app scales and you add more complexity, the code signing scales with it automatically. And then EAS Build, you can build in the cloud, and then if you have a team, you can like provision the app for that team, code sign it for different devices, re-sign it for different devices without having to rebuild it, and then download it. And those pieces all together create a flow where you technically could work without Xcode or Android Studio. A lot of people have had pretty good success with that. But if you want like the more advanced cases, then you're going to want to like dig in and use Xcode and Android Studio regardless. Yeah. There's kind of this misconception that React Native is for easier development. But in reality, it's for more powerful development done easier. Very similar to React. Like when you learn web development, like my baby sister's learning web development. I don't tell her to like, I'm like, yeah, you will learn React. And she like she's like, where do I find React? And I was like, actually, let's set you up with like some HTML, CSS stuff. And you learn some of the basics, and then you add on React, and it's like, now you can, I think as the bar moves higher and higher over time, it's like, in order to feel some sense of like satisfaction with what you're developing, you need to be able to have more powerful tools. Like, I think it's not super satisfying if nowadays, like at the end of the day, you have like a blue screen. But if at the end of the day you have like some buttons and a list and like images, then it's a bit better. So yeah, React Native is the way we think about it as we develop it is that it is for these more intense use cases, and like how can you really blow past the simple stuff very easily, the stuff that users expect to be there, and then focus primarily on delivering like this exceptional experience.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about writing code on different platforms other than just like an iPhone. So there are these other React Native platforms like React Native Vision. The potential to write code for Apple's new VR AR products. Have you explored those at all?
Yeah. Did you guys
No.
Did you guys buy a Vision Pro?
$4,500 after tax is a little too pricey to be an early bird on this one, I think.
Yeah, it's expensive.
What about you?
Yeah, I mean, my reasoning there was kind of like every dollar I currently have has come from the fact that at some point in my life I got my hands on one of these native devices and built native apps for it. So probably it would be a reasonable purchase. But even then, I couldn't lie to myself. It was a mistake. This is not gonna. But yeah, I did think like it would be cool to have Expo support on Vision, so I got it for that purpose.
Does Expo plan to like expand to any of those other platforms? Because I know there's React Native Windows, React Native Mac, like there might even be a React Native watch. I don't know.
Yeah. So like with Expo, it is a native library for a native app, right? It's whereas maybe something like Cordova is kind of like you're in a whole new world of web views inside of apps. So with Expo, you can write as much Swift and as much Kotlin as you'd like for your respective platforms, and you can add Expo wherever you need inside of that. So if you have an Expo app, you can today, just pop in there and add a Vision OS target and write the Vision part in Swift if you'd like. Our primary focus is on this mobile development story. Mobile compute makes up like half of the internet consumption, and I think it's just really important that this problem is solved because it is incredibly difficult to make native apps, and it just really shouldn't be. Like the people have a lot to say, and making apps is a really, really important way to say things for a lot of people. With the Apple devices, they all use these like M chips. They're like M1, M2, M3, and those all can support cross-platform, kind of in a watered down capacity. Like it's not baked out yet, but if you were to think about the time it would take us and the complexity in order to like add native platforms without the M chip, then I think by that time the M chip cross-platform would be about. So basically, Apple's kind of going in the UWP, like the Windows direction, where you can write an Apple app once and it runs on different Apple products. So right now you can run in a React Native app on Vision. It runs, I think, is like a supported on Vision, or support like an iPad, like not optimized for Vision app. And then there's this React Native Vision fork, which has like 1,000 lines of code in it, which enables the ability to have it run like as a proper Vision OS app. But if you want access to any of those primitives, that's kind of the benefit of React Native, right? Like Vision OS came out with these new primitives. Like here's this button, which is crazy blurry and has like this wild shimmer effect on it. If you were using like Cordova, you would have to kind of re-implement that in CSS. And with React Native, you just make a binding to the underlying native button that Apple released. So it's pretty optimized for switching platforms. Our focus at Expo though is primarily on mobile devices, and I think the main device class that we don't support is Windows, like native Windows. If we had that, then I think that touches basically every platform, because you could currently deploy your Expo iOS app to Mac with M1 devices.
Have you seen the work that the Arc browser team is doing? They're like trying to port
the Arc browser with Swift. Yeah, I've seen that.
Yeah, like Swift Windows. I was like, wild.
It's another one of these whole new world things. Like Expo can be thought of kind of like Netflix. It's like there's a really refined version for these individual platforms. At no point is Expo like shoehorning its theme into a different like there are different paradigms which work cross platform like React, and those are where things are universal. But in terms of like changing the language, it's tricky. Like JavaScript runs on all these devices. ARM chips have like special concessions for running JavaScript, and yeah, so we do really respect the native platforms that we develop for, and the native developers for these platforms. Like at Expo, we're all native developers, and we care very deeply about the platform. So we want the experience that you get to be as native as possible. Like universal linking is a native feature, and your app feels super native when you can deep link and it instantly goes there. A lot of apps, when you universally link, like Twitter, a lot of people will experience this where you like open it and then you'll kind of see it just sitting there loading, and then maybe it will load in and you'll see it forgot about the link. You have to like swipe back and tap on it, and then it remembers it. And that's because like the orchestration of like data fetching has interrupted the routing. And these are problems that when you kind of frame them like that, they sound like things that have existed on web that were, solved in some meaningful way. But yeah, in the same way that React binds to the web and it's a true website, React Native binds to native and needs to be a true native app.
So recently, there's been some new things in the React world, that being React server components. When we had Nate from Tamagui on, he had a visceral reaction to server components. He's like, mobile apps are local first apps, and that's the way they should be. React server components don't make sense in that paradigm. Is your take the same, or do you think differently?
Yeah, I don't think so. In regards to React server components, specifically on native, I don't think that server components are like diametrically opposed to offline support. I actually think that they play into offline pretty well. If you think about like how a React Native server or React server components work, is each server component is rendered at build time, and then the components will indicate what their caching and revalidation should be. So like when should it update from the server? But by default, they are made at build time and shipped effectively what could be offline. So if you built an app that truly was fully offline, which is very few apps, by the way, and the apps that are offline are generally apps that Apple will consume, like pull into their ecosystem and, Sherlock. So in the cases where you do have content that is online, it does make sense to have it could make sense to have the rendering be closer to the data. And this ties in really nicely with OTA. Like OTA is probably one of the leading reasons that you go for React Native, is this ability to send code that orchestrates the native code that's already on the device over the air. So if you think about the native code that you actually ship, that's like the browser, and the JavaScript is kind of like the web page, but it's highly refined for that browser. And offline is actually really interesting in that context because, like offline on web, you can use service workers, and service workers are just so fundamentally difficult to use that it's almost dangerous to use them, right? Like if they cache too aggressively, then you can't send a bug fix, and you'll get contacts and support, and people will be like, hey, why does my URL not update? And then it's, like, okay, clear your browser cache. With a native app, you could effectively have the same service worker API, because if you had that issue where things were cached too aggressively, you could just push a new binary through the store and it will nuke the cache. Like you have that mechanism. On web, the equivalent would be if you could push a website update which updated Chrome, and like obviously it's not a thing. So I do think that we have some levers to pull to make offline work really nicely, and I just don't think server components really break any of that. I think server components are actually going to be really fantastic on React Native. So I built, I think, was maybe the first public prototype of server components. I have a video on it. And it was the kind of context was that someone was like, it can't be done. And I was like, oh, you can do it. And I've dug into that a lot more recently. And the results have just been fantastic, like incredible. The things that you can do with server components on native, these are going to be things like static generation, right? If you think about like the RSC file format, a lot of this actually works better for native than it does for web. Because on web, people always have these questions like, where does the HTML come from? And the answer is like, you have this extra renderer that sits on top of the RSC renderer that takes the RSC and turns that into HTML. So RSC can kind of be thought of as like native HTML. And if the browser just supported loading RSC directly, you wouldn't need the HTML. So if you think about like the native app as being the browser, if you could make it however you want. You could make it load RSC files directly. And then you could create, things where maybe the UI shows up before the JavaScript is loaded. Or you could, compute complex components at build time or on the server. Right now, we have really no mechanism to do build time static generation for native apps. So if you have gradients and complex things where props are being computed at runtime, you just always pay that cost, even if they never change. A good example would probably be Markdown. Markdown has lots of rules. Like if it's the first H1, then the padding needs to be larger than if it's the second H1. And all those rules just run on the user's device when they load up the MDX or the Markdown or something. With server components, you could compile all of those rules out, unless they change, in which case you could compile them maybe in a separate thread on the same device. Maybe you could compile them in the server. So I think a lot of the problems that people have had have maybe come from a particular implementation of server components rather than server components themselves. It has been extremely difficult to implement. There's like no documentation. Even though I talked to people who work at Meta on React like every day, it's still very tricky to figure out how a lot of this works. There's crazy nested opinions everywhere that kind of span between React and the particular implementation that currently exists. Like one that I just encountered yesterday was the error that you get. Like I didn't realize you couldn't use class components with server components. Like class components can't be server components. Had no idea. It makes sense, but I'd never seen that written anywhere, and I've read a lot about them. And the error that you get is really confusing. And apparently the way that you want to balance that error out with like the use state error, because the use state error is pretty good. It's like you can't use state here because it doesn't exist. The way to balance it out is that you have like an AST pass, and the AST will just look and see, like it will match if you're extending a class component in a React server environment, and then it should throw a similar error. So you have like this kind of weird asymmetrical interface. But all this is like the implementation and the errors. And I think in terms of the UX, like what the user will experience, and then when it's really refined, what the developer will experience is going to be just incredible. Like it's so many new tools in your tool belt. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. It's really, I can't state enough how excited I am for this technology. And I don't think it's going to really get in the way of offline first. I do think that offline first, like one way that you could think of offline first is kind of like optimistic UI. And like before you make some network requests, do something locally and then update. I do think that the particular implementation of server components that most people have seen is very like everything goes to the server first heavy. It doesn't have to be like that. Even the server navigation in RSC it seems like it doesn't have to be that. Like it seems kind of optimal for the web where you are always online. But what if you just had like one giant root server component and that represented all of your routes? And then you did what was effectively like client side navigation throughout that server. Like, I don't see why that isn't possible and why you couldn't cut out all of the server interactions if you wanted to. I can see how people got to this place though, based on what they have currently seen.
Yeah, I think this is one of those interesting technologies. So, I mean, we talked to Christopher in the last episode. It reminds me a little bit of like JSX when people were talking about JSX and React, and it's like, there's a lot of like people are like, what is this? Why are you doing this? Whatever. And there were like some fundamentally good principles there. It's like actually co-location of UI is a really powerful concept that enables composition in a way that you really couldn't do before. And I think the challenge with RSCs, I'm sure that there are a lot of great ideas here, but it's also complex to communicate. Because you had said something just now. It's like, oh, well, fundamentally, React server components are built on the server, and I mean, built. They're built at build time, or they're generated at build time, and
At a different computer than your computer. Like,
yeah, and I think that like the name is a little bit of a misnomer in some cases because people are like considering it's like, oh, it's running on a server, and it's like, yes, but, and then I don't know. So it'll be interesting to see how it evolves and like the language changes, and obviously documentation and different implementations and stuff will go a long way.
Yeah, I always call them serial components. Like it just makes so much more sense to me. I just say server components. Like I had to like retrain myself before I talk about them publicly. But when I think about them, it's serial components because I think is both the serialization of your components, but then also I think fundamentally one thing that's a little that I'm not so sure about in server components, because I've said a lot of positive things, but one thing I'm not so sure is that opting into reactivity with a client boundary. So like the default is server components, and then you say, okay, this component is interactive and it has state. And I think that's a little weird for React to be something that you opt into. It would feel like you kind of opt out of reactivity with React. And then I also think there's some weirdness around like HMR. Like it's not as intuitive as when everything is a client component, because you have fast refresh, which updates the component and then it changes the state within the component. But with the server component, it's like what should refresh? The basic, the root component, when that changes, that should refresh. It's pretty obvious. But the root component does come from what is effectively like a server action. It is an API route that runs in a React server environment and it returns RSC. However, other server actions within your app that return RSC, should those update? Like, should later in your app, should the request be remade and then the component come down and like re-trigger when you update the JSX inside of a server action? It's hard to say. So I think ergonomically there are some tricky bits in there, but for as low level as I am when I'm writing Expo, it's very exciting for me. The ideas and the potential. And I also think that I don't know, in many ways, I think server components are more interesting for native than they could ever possibly be for web. Like, I think a lot of the stigma comes from people who are like, okay, well, everything already can be rendered on the server, and there already is a static representation, and we already have data fetching, and we already can do build time static generation, but you can't do any of those things on native in a reasonable way. And so to be able to all of a sudden do all of them it's pretty game changing. Like if you just like go onto Google and you just search like server driven UI, you're going to see like how Lyft does it, how Uber does it, and how Shopify does it. And like everyone has their own implementation of this at a certain level. It's such a complicated and important feature. And I think in the same way that with React Native, where if you wanted reactivity, you would kind of pay the cost of all this extra complexity in order to get reactivity on native. A lot of that has kind of gone away over time, and now you have reactivity just built into the native platform in many ways. With like Swift UI, it's like they've copied so much React. But if you want server-driven UI, I think React Native is the perfect place for that, because you have your native UI, you have your Swift elements, your Kotlin elements, whatever you want, and you bind that to a primitive, which then exposes it to the server. So in this case, that would be JSX. And then that JSX, you can now basically orchestrate, I want these native components to mount, and I want like the instructions for those to be generated at build time, but I don't have to like go out of my way to say these are generated at build time. I want the compiler to magically know that these should be generated at build time. And these parts that are, data driven, I want those to update, and I want those to update on the server, and I want those to update on the server in the context of an iOS or an Android app. and I want them to be versioned as well. So a lot of really important just native problems from a frameworkless perspective, I think, are solved with server components. So yeah, I think it's going to be game changing. It's going to be huge, whole new world. Very exciting.
Yeah, that leads into our last question pretty well. On the podcast, we always like to ask like a future facing question of the field that the person is currently involved in. So
right after I said whole new world. Yeah, okay.
So what do you think the future of cross-platform development in React is? Like, I've seen a lot of React fatigue on the internet lately. Do you think React's going to go away?
Well, I think the future will look like server components, and I think, I mean, a lot of my feelings are kind of tied up in this server component thought. And in Expo Router, I think Expo Router is going to be really important. It's already proven to be very important. And I have people come to me all the time, like consultancies, agencies, and they're like, when can we just use like one? Like, there's a lot of people who have kind of sold customers on, hey, if we just swap from frameworkless to React Native, then you get it. And then they've enjoyed the benefits of being on the single. And now they're like, how can we do that for another platform? So we already kind of have we have like the acquisition there. You just need to deliver on the actual framework and make it good. In terms of React fatigue, I think people are just maybe tired of like particular implementations of React. There's a big shift, big change. I'm super excited for React Forget. I think React Forget is going to be fantastic. I'm so excited for it. I hope my hopes aren't up too high for that, but they probably are. But memos are just not my favorite thing. I don't think I've ever really written a memo correctly. I learn new things about them all the time. I'm excited to not have to deal with them. And I think a lot of people saw that potential early on, and then they implemented that in different frameworks because they were able to move a bit faster. And so people are like, well, you can get all of those from over here. And I just don't think there's enough dialogue around Forget. So I think whenever Meta decides to release that, that'll be really important. Like, I remember when server components came out, I was at NextConf, and I just remember thinking and saying, if they had instead ushered out Forget, people would be pretty hyped, because React was already kind of teetering on being pretty complicated, and there was all these other solutions that were more reactive, and they were like, actually, let's get really complicated with it. So I think Forget brings it down a bunch of pegs. I do think that there are elements of server components that simplify, not React, but framework implementations of React. You don't have to think about, is this SSG or SSR too much? You just think about how frequently does this update? I think mixing will be really exciting there. It's mixing, some parts are built statically and other parts are built on the server, as opposed to route by route. And then it's hard to say which way things will go with the Vision, Vision Pro, if that will be important. Apple's been collecting patents for Vision Pro for their first one was maybe 17 years ago, and they have over 5,000 patents, I think they said when they announced it. So there's definitely a lot of parts to VR that are important, and other people just have not been allowed to use because they are legally not allowed to do anything with them for 17 years. These have been collected up. So there's a chance that computing is in a pretty good state, and we just don't know because no one has been allowed to try different stuff. And if that comes out and it does do well, then maybe that dips into the desktop space a little bit. A lot of, I think, web usage, the majority of web usage comes from desktop, right? On native devices, I think it's close to 90% of internet usage comes from a native app, right, as opposed to a mobile web browser. And so the majority of the influence of the web comes from desktop-based devices. And if Apple really throttles the web on Vision, similar to what they've done on iOS, and it kind of takes some of the place of your desktop stationary computing, so you can get those bigger monitors and you can get these gestures and stuff, I think if that happens, then maybe we will see more like and it wouldn't really be, I don't think, native mobile so much as maybe like native desktop. Like that's where the app sector falls there. So I think that could be kind of interesting. Or none of that will happen at all because it's too expensive and like who would use it. But yeah, mostly I'm excited for Forget and React Native Server Components and Expo Router. I think those are going to be like 3 killer pieces of technology. And I don't think people are going to get too burnt out on React. I do think Astro is fantastic, though. Have you guys used Astro?
Yeah, it's great.
It's awesome. Yeah, like there's different types of websites, and there's web apps and websites, and Astro really kills it with the website space. So you want like static content. It's really hard to compete with that. In a lot of ways, I think you do pay the cost of React being this like universal mechanism when you build a website, and a lot of times it's like you don't actually have to pay that cost. You could just build some static thing with Astro, and it's pretty slick and easy. And that's not to say that React could never be as easy as Astro is, but I think the same thing that people think with Expo, where it's like Expo maybe would struggle to be the best in each platform because it's trying to be really good at multiple platforms. I think that also applies to React. Now, I don't think that's like a huge deal, but I do think that with React having, opinions about the event system and various opinions about scoping, reactivity, those do, cause it to maybe move at a slower rate. Also, I think just the success of it makes it move at a slower rate. So, I don't know. Like, I think Astro will keep doing really great, and really excited for that. But that's just websites. One thing that really excites me about native development is just the fact that you get to think in terms of first principles. So you get to think about like, is this the best possible thing that the device that I'm holding in my hand is capable of doing? And with web, you're limited by browser vendors and specifications, which are fantastic for various types of innovation. But when you buy the Vision Pro, it's just like it was on the front of my mind. One thing that you need to do is that they measure your head, like the size and shape of your head, so that it's fit correctly. And in order to do that, they send you a web link, and then that web link opens an app clip, and then that app clip has the access to the high fidelity cameras on the front of your iPhone, and from there you can scan your face, and then they know which size vision to give you, which size headband. And I just think that it's fantastic that if you're a native developer, you can think in first principles. Okay, we have these devices. We need to minimize the amount of complaints and like returns that people might do. It's like, how can we solve this for the most amount of people? And if you're limited by browser vendors, if you're limited by app stores, then these things get in the way, and you can't just build the best possible thing. And if you can't build the best possible thing, then it's like, I don't know, maybe it's not as exciting, and you're probably not going to work as hard on it. Yeah, it's an exciting space to be in. I'm really grateful to be able to work in app development.
Yeah, I'm real excited about the future too. RSC seems like a great innovation, and React Forget can't come soon enough. Like, I don't want to write use callback ever again, or even have to think about what callbacks are doing. But yeah, thanks for coming on the episode. This was a lot of fun. Learned a lot about Expo I didn't know and where it's gone in the last few years, and I'm excited to see what you guys put out.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, you should give it a try. It's a good time.
Yeah, Evan, again, congratulations on V3 launch. We'll be eagerly looking forward to V4. I wish y'all all the best with that.